and I'm an
We love
apologist
the
right now.
industrial Justin Carmien. We think it's great. You're sitting in the fucking factory while we be nerds with just maps and books behind.
Let's call it
Exactly.
that. Let's call this
Yeah.
the factory, right? This is the venue.
The factory 2.0. Oh, what is that? Shit. It's the factory 2.0. I think the first one was Andy Warhol, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, I just want to make sure I see this mic button. It's moved a bit, but I see it. Okay,
But
so
Alexander,
Tom,
your connection seems to be like a little bit unstable. Could that be?
I don't know. I think Justin's connection is stable. I look stable over here.
Okay.
Are you stable, Tom?
Yes, I'm mentally stable. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Let's go with it as it is. And can always press a button 6 months from now, and AI will fix it. Will look terrific, sound terrific, as long as the content is great. Everything from now on is about.
that's funny.
Okay,
Yeah.
so welcome everybody. Welcome Justin. Welcome Alexander to our second round of, well, how do we call it? Metaphysics in the factory. So I'm really excited for the second talk. We decided that you, Justin, will take the lead for this one because you have some question in mind and some impulses and motivation. So why don't you start us off, basically?
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, I'm going to jump right off from our last conversation, I think. So I'm going to draw from some comments that you had given, Alexander. And let's hopefully see where this goes, and maybe we can wrap this. I remember the original topic was a philosophy of time. We kind of skated around that, but we didn't land there. Let's see if we land there this time. If we need a third session, that's probably okay too, right? We should probably just go where the excitement and where the passion is, right? But Alexander, jumping off what you said last time, you were making some distinctions for me that admittedly I hadn't written about in this latest book, Through Parallax. And that is this difference between possibility and potential. And so you triggered me. I needed to think more about that. And I think it came at the right time, our conversation. So thank you, I'll say. As I gear up to finishing the third book, which is my third book, which is the sequel to the Metaphysics of the Alethian, I was getting to a point where I needed to apply the metaphysics. And when I made that application, this is where potential became important for me. So again,
So we can just summarize from the last conversation and say that in my work, possibility covers two different things that we gain by keeping separate. It's the virtual and the potential. And then the third category is the actual. That comes later. And you could put them in order. The virtual is always prior to the potential, and the potential is followed by the actual. So we framed that the last time so people know what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's good that you say that, and you would have done a better job than I would have. Let's come back to that, actually, because I think I'll have some questions for you about how you have resolved some of the challenges or some of the problems that I have been considering since our talk. So let's come back to you on that topic, right? Particularly about potential, because I think it's obvious that, or possibility, I think it's obvious. Anyone who's read my book, I clearly build a historical narrative of metaphysics, and that is in some way starting with Kant, who is interested in the conditions of possibility. And I like this approach because it allows the study, the science, I say that because I think we should need to touch on science some more also, of making a phenomenological observation, looking at the phenomena that you're presented with, but keeping it at a distance, treating it as something of an object that's removed from an object that we would call the self, and then finding out how those impressions strike you, right? That's what I see as happening, and how I interpret Kant, Hegel, and Heidegger, and the thread that I pull from my book. That's kind of the phenomenological commitment, I call it in my book, insofar as I treat metaphysics as a science. It's always a bit removed, right? So you can observe it. And when I make that move, then I find also then interesting where Heidegger goes with this. I'll skip over Hegel, and maybe I need to leave some room for you guys to talk. But I go to Heidegger here because he does something interesting. Okay, you're doing thumbs up. You like his move also, because he actually unites what I would call what Kant did was form the structure that the possibilities go through, right? And he took these two and kind of united them into Dasein, which then becomes both the possibilities themselves and the framework of the possibilities, the limiting conditions or whatever, right? I still think he's being scientific, though, and I think this is Alexander and Tom, if you have some things to say about this, let's talk about science more, kind of the constitution of it, because I see him as being very scientific. He's still making that scientific structure that is kind of removed from him and doing the phenomenological investigation. Nonetheless, I think it's novel what he did by uniting these two. In my book, then, I think I'm actually helping Heidegger out on a confusion, and I can cite maybe thinkers like Dugin, who I think have been led by Heidegger's confusion on this. You agree? Good. And I think I'm being much more clear about it and Tom, you'll very clearly recognize this, having edited my books, I established the proiectum as the framework and the subjectum as the possibilities which go through this. And I think in Heidegger's language, you would call that possibilities, the structure, and this object called the self comes out on the other side. And I'm clearing up Heidegger on that, I think. Because Dugin, for example, just to say some quick words about Dugin, I've had conversations with him, and he seems to think that kind of like I think he makes the fault of like scientific realism, you would call it, like the description of science becomes the actual thing itself.
Well, Dugin is a vulgar Heideggerian. It's like talking about Ayn Rand in relation to Nietzsche.
Tell me, I'm very curious what you think.
Yeah, no, I don't think he's. I mean, he thinks he's Heideggerian. He quotes Heidegger all the time. I'm currently studying Graham Harman's new book, Waves and Stones, and I've been fighting with Harman for years. But at least we've united around the Aristotelian revival. And I think if Critchley was the Heideggerian of our time, and you certainly have that ambition, Justin, which I applaud, Graham Harman is the big Heideggerian of our time. And what's interesting here is in Harman, obviously the book is called Waves and Stones. We wrote a book called Process and Event. It's the same title. It's another recycling of difference or repetition by Deleuze, right? So he's obviously dealing with the same thing. Like, what if continuity versus discretion is not only fundamental and a break within science itself? So science breaks in two. We call those physics and subphysics in our work, which is clear because they're incompatible with one another. But incompatibility is also the beginning of irreducibility. So it's a wonderful place to start to do like what we do emergence vector theory. But let me go back to what we're talking about here and about the possibility. The reason why this whole debate occurred, that Kantian possibility was kind of sloppy because it mixed up two different things, was that it helps us to have a category which is powerless and to have a category which is powerful within possibility. And all you need to do is to put them along the timeline. And basically then you have to throw off the virtual with phenomenology. And in this, Deleuze agrees. And then you can place the potential with epistemology, because there's an agent now, a sort of proto-subject, very docile, engaged with the world, and that's very different. And this debate came out of a discussion I had, for example, with Alex Ebert several years ago on relationalism. And this is another one of those, torn things in philosophy ever since Plato versus Aristotle. Is the relata first or is the relation first? And most people naturally assume that the relata is first. They assume that the world is full of objects, and suddenly these objects have a relationship with one another because we look at ourselves that way, that we are ourselves, and this self that has relations with others. But if you go all the way back to our own origin, being born by our mothers and all that, there was only relation. There is no difference between mother and child in the fantasy, neither of the mother or the child, to be honest about it. While you're carrying something in your womb, there is no difference. So the origin is certainly united. So people have assumed from Nietzsche onto Whitehead that we now, in a modern context, assume that relationalism is the name of the game, meaning the relations are prior to relata. It's just that people don't understand the huge amounts of problems and challenges they get when they assume that. For me personally, the best lazy option is to say relata relations, just dialectical deadlock. None of them is prior to the other. We're living in a world consisting of relata relations. But if I would really try to pursue relationalism as first philosophy, I still have to have something prior to relations. And this is where the virtual serves that role perfectly. That's why I'm not very interested in the virtual. It's just a category that needs to be there. So that then going into Dasein and possibility and the power of possibility, the potentiality of an agent interacting with the world, for example, you had Heidegger's Dasein. For Dasein to fully go into this mode, I'm proposing to call that term potential.
Okay, so let me just jump in with one thing, because you both touched on this, and I had this thought actually the last time we talked, because what you both alluded to is a kind of point to critical skepticism. That means, what is the relationship between the mind and the self to the observed phenomenon? So is that because we're talking about Kant and idealism and Platon? So where do you guys come from which angle? Just to make that clear for the audience, like what is the relationship between these two things?
Can I answer by asking Alexander a clarifying question? It might,
Sure.
in the question, it might elucidate my position, right? So this virtual, which is not an object, I have needed to pull on in my metaphysical architectonic, but I'm curious because I'm genuinely curious in you, Alexander. So yeah, so what is the character? Maybe, how do you describe the virtual? Does it tend to belong to the subject? Because that's where, or is it a completely objective type of phenomena that you have some distance to when you do your investigation and you relate to it more as an object?
No, it's not an
Or
object.
another
It
way.
can't be an object. Can't be an object. That's the point. So by working with three, like Hegel did wonderfully, by working with the three categories and put them along the timeline, which Hegel did, you get the indeterminate and you get the determinate. And Hegel basically said that we always have to assume that the past is determinate. So it looks determinate by looking at it from where we're standing. But at the same time, the future is indeterminate because the future is open, and even our own active agency has freedom and is engaged in creating that future. I never do free will because freedom and will have nothing to do with each other. And I probably hear Tom agrees with me. One of the sloppiest things is talk about free will. I said, which one do you mean, freedom or will? Will is not free. Will whatever it wills, it wills. No, freedom of choice is what we're looking at in that case. But let's go back to the benefit of having three categories is that the virtual is just prior to the potential. So all you can ever observe and engage with in the world is the potential. Suddenly you're in a new present, and in that present there are potentials, and those potentials are many, so you can make choices. And then they become the one after you can't do anything about it. Once you have to accept the present has passed, and the present, that present moment, that momentum, as I call it, that momentum has now become a thing of the past, then it's an object. Then it's that place, that time, where whatever happened, who I was then. The kind of proto-subject engaged with the world in a Dasein I was then. And that gives me full subjectivity through reflection. By sitting in the new present, but observing the old present as now a past. This is what Nietzsche says, amor fati, accept what happened, you can't do anything about it. It's a solid, monstrous one, can't do anything about it. History is fixed. This is the determinate in Hegel. The only thing with Hegel is that he never really went into the present. This is where Heidegger is frustrated. This is where I'm frustrated. I'm not frustrated with the fact that he talks about infinite freedom into the future and a totally closed past, because that's actually how time operates. Time, the present in time, is essentially the collapse of the infinite into the one. But by making it the many and by calling it transdeterminate, it's like a wobbly state where the indeterminate has not yet become determinate, which is where I can act. That's where I should be. That's potential. That's Dasein, that I can act. Now, only then to complete the time frame, to complete the time axis, I have to invent, I have to borrow in, so to speak, a category of the virtual. And the virtual to me then it's just the infinite. It's an infinite amount of possibilities, an infinite amount of connections. But none of them exist because none of them have any power to them, because it's only through relations that power is is generated. And that's actually how physics operates too. Without a Higgs field, you can't have any power to anything. So I just thought that's a nice way of describing the virtual. And this is why Deleuze comes across as such a fucking hippie. Harman hates Deleuze, to be honest about it, because he made the other mistake. He only had virtual and actual. By skipping Hegel, not going through Hegel properly, he didn't understand you need virtual, potential, and actual. And this is where I meet Heidegger. Heidegger did the hard work. He invented the Dasein, and I sort of want to jump into that by creating the category of potential. Virtual is just that anything can happen in the future category.
Alexander,
Can
yeah.
I ask? May I ask something? Just to clarification to understand. So, what like where is virtuality? How much is it connected to your cognition? And is that something that you could also describe as chaos? Because chaos is also generative in a kind of sense.
Taking your will concept, Amarque and will cannot be generated in the virtual because it's just if it's infinite of anything and it's powerless, it's just pure possibilities, an infinite amount. You can't relate to that. So you have to be able to make a choice. And funnily enough, that's what time is. Time is the collapse of the infinite into the one. I'm adamant about this. And now physicists are listening because time has to be understood that way. So it's the infinite collapsing into the one. And by collapsing into the one, there's that one point in between, which is the many. And the many to me is what a present state is. And I call this philosophy momentalism, not presentism, because it's not about what is prior to what has higher value, because there's no valuation. It's just how things work. It's just how time would work if we eliminated space and thought time properly through in the philosophy of time, as we all through trying to do. And the great thing about will is that will needs a relation. It can be proto-subjective. This is Heidegger's genius. It can be proto-subjective. It can be prior to subject. It can just be that you haven't reflected. You just instantly will something. And that will, when it's exposed in an agent, banging the hammer on the table without reflection, just because this proto-subject bangs hammers, right? That hammer and that table have a relation. The hammer and table is an object that has a relation to the agency of the proto-subject. And therefore, as soon as you bang the hammer, there's something thinking, oh, I just banged the hammer. Subject, object, everything falls into place. So instantly after that momentum, subject and object starts operating through reflection.
So Alexander, I follow what you're saying. I believe 100%, and I appreciate you coming into Heidegger and explaining it that way. I think it's a good illustration of the famous carpenter and the hammer and the wooden boards. I still, and you may read this as a critique. I'm going to pose it as a clarifying question, because I still think that I've now read your synthesis, creating God in the internet world, and much of your process and event. And when I read them, I still find myself in a position of not knowing where I stand. And I'm going to call back to Hegel in order to describe that feeling that I get when I read your books. And that's because I think Hegel was a bit clear about this braiding of the I, the you, and the we. And he's sitting in a position of the we together with his reader, observing these objects, but then also kind of taking the position of each of those objects and braiding these together and coming up with the phenomenology of spirit. I kind of miss that in your work, knowing where I stand. And I think this comes back to Tom's question, and I tried to reiterate it, saying, what is this virtual? Is it related to the will? And now you've explained what the will is later. I buy that. I totally get it. Nonetheless, I still have this kind of I guess I would call it like this, like a cosmological study of when I'm sitting in the position of cosmology, I don't know where I'm at, right? And I feel this also with some other, I mentioned Dugan earlier, I felt it with his works as well. I'm going to leave it to you, though, to answer kind of, do you understand
Yeah.
the question?
How can you possibly imagine an infinite difference? You can't. Nobody can think infinity. So it's just beyond our capacity. But it's a category that's acquired. Graham Priest, another Heideggerian, has done it wonderfully because he was also considering why are we using the term existence on everything we talk about ontologically, which is sloppy. because not everything exists. And then you go back to these endless, boring, tedious discussions where philosophers define the ontic and ontological, or noumenal and phenomenal, if you like, and go back. And I find those tedious discussions, they're fucking sixth grade or whatever. I just hate it. And John and I just sorted that out. We just said there's the ontic outside of whatever your subjectivity is, and there's the ontological, which your subject is creating to make sense of the world. So that's basically what Kant did originally. After the Kantian turn, we stuck with that. But here's the thing. People then start assuming a lot of things like infinity, like they just say the word and they think they've said something that makes sense. But if you try to think infinity, you go psychotic madness. But we have to be able to assume that the category exists and humbly accept we can't think it. Why? Because then Graham Priest says, if existence only is now, and I'm a monumentalist, that's also presentist, all that exists is a now, and a now, and a now. And after now has existed, stuck, history, ice cold, done with, no movement. And that means there's a future. But since something is going on at the present, the only way to describe the future is not as another stone. It's not another one. No, it's the infinite. Okay, so then Graham Priest just says, then we can say that in our imagination, by being confronted with what exists, again, this is Dasein. You see how much Heidegger there is in Graham Priest? By existence, is only being in the Dasein. There's no other existence. That means that the past to us makes sense to us as it subsists in the present. I'm sitting with you guys here, having this conversation in the present. Everything was set up and now. My entire life up until now, the entire world history before I was born, all of that subsists. It's funny that even physicists are finding this useful now, for example, do stochastic mathematics and shit like that. But it's really, really useful to think of subsistence. But if you have subsistence for anything that no longer exists, which is now history, you must have a category for that which does not yet exist. So you can start thinking what does not yet exist, even if it's infinite difference. And that psychosis ahead of you and the neurosis behind you deserve two words. And Graham Priest brilliantly says, subsistence, neurosis, the one, the past. Future, oh God, psychotic madness ahead of us. Chaos, like Tom just said. Well, then he called it absistence. I think it's a brilliant term. I borrowed straight from Graham Priest in my work. So for me, the philosophy's time is really to do future, present, and past properly, because it's been sloppily overdone with, and only with Hegel was there a break when somebody started taking time seriously. I seriously think that the shift from Kant to Hegel is the shift from a philosopher of space to the philosopher of time. And since then, space is nothing but a subcategory of time. Even Roger Penrose, all these guys exist. Yeah, space is tied to mass, whatever. What's interesting is time, and time is still the big mystery.
Just as a side question, Alexander. So if we talk about this infinite now, and then you mentioned 2 times the psychotic state. And I mean, it's like, okay, we're doing philosophy now, but I think what you're talking about is also like a state that you can experience when you're in that trans-psychotic state. And I mean, I have no other words for this, but
this is exactly the point.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, and this is what we try to do. The 2 ways of achieving it. This was Nishida's frustration with Hegel. He said, there's no pure experience in Hegel. He's missing that category. But pure experience is an active agent, actively seeking the pure phenomenological state prior to the proto-subject. That's exactly why it's associated with ego dissolution. World and self become one. That's deep, pure meditation. I do it through Zen. The inside Zen does that. That's like going into a sort of phenomenological neurosis. Right? The other state is to go to absolute infinite bliss, or the infinite now. That's why they call it the infinite now, because it's a contradictory term. Because you can clearly not put words on any of these. Nishida agrees. Pure experience and the infinite now cannot be vocal. We cannot put words. We cannot symbolize them. That's exactly why they're so weird. Because in the infinite now, you go through absolute ego dissolution through absolute bliss. And it's scary like hell. It's completely psychotic. It's only because you've done the work to get there that you realize you're not going mad. And when you get there, you know it because it's incredibly ecstatic, hopefully shared by somebody, but it's incredibly ecstatic, but your ego is dissolved, and you know you're not going to stay there. It would be totally terrifying to be there if you would have to stay there. But knowing you're going to only be there to briefly visit, you can enjoy the visit before you go back. And suddenly, you know, boom, ego comes back in. And the proto-subjectivity comes back in by acting with the world. I've seen people in psychosis, for example, induced on drugs, and I've just taken their hand, Heideggerian, right? Taken their hand and put their hand on the body and said, there was a damn hand. That hand grabbed the body. I wonder whose that body is. And I said, oh, me, back. And ego's back again. And I find these states for us philosophers incredibly interesting to go to. Science can't get there. You can have these experiences, but it's not where you're supposed to go back and go back. You're not learning anything there because you're not an active agent. You're dissolved. But of course, because it only takes that little jump into a future not here yet. Like it's like you jumping into an existence as if it existed. And that's how your brain operates in that state.
If I can reflect on some personal experience about what you triggered there, Tom, and what Alexander's elucidated, I have done a fair amount of drugs in my life. And I have to say, with that and reading philosophy, I know people talk about expanding the mind. They use all these silly words from the 1960s, right? Silly phrases. I never once felt like I learned anything from having these experiences. So, okay, that resonates with you. That's interesting. So I'm
There
totally
is
not
no,
with Timothy
that's
Leary, like
it's
expand the
pure
mind.
phenomenology. There is no epistemology there. There's nothing
Yeah,
to learn.
I totally agree.
There is no self, and if there's no self, and world of self is one, fine, it might be healing because you're basically back in your mother's womb. It's pre-subjective, right? But there's nothing to learn from drugs, exactly, because at least not in that state. Because if you go to that state, there's nothing there. That's the point, exactly.
Right. This is
So you get it.
This is very
It's
good.
free.
Yeah.
It's phenomenology without epistemology. That is why we philosophers keep phenomenology and epistemology separate. And my argument is we keep them separate because on the timeline that makes sense. Phenomenology is prior to epistemology. Epistemology comes through interacting with the world. And it's the only way we ever learn anything. And by interacting through the world and then reflecting on that, we create a proper subject, a consciousness, a full-on consciousness. And we do that through ontology. And then ontology throws back to epistemology. That is Hegel's onto-epistemological loop, where he says to Kant, Kant has never understood there's a loop going on here. But there's also another loop prior to that, which is what I'm interested in with Nishida and Heidegger. And that loop is the loop between phenomenology and epistemology, as if the agency can disappear and go back into non-agency. World can come back without self again, and they go back and forth. That's really trippy, but it can exist. We call that phenomenology to address the fact that phenomenology and noumenology are united.
So,
Well, it kind of depends. Sorry if I might just add. I mean, it depends a little bit on what we mean with learning, because like to experience that psychotic state is, I wouldn't classify it as learning, but you learn something on another level, wouldn't you?
well, Alexander's called it, it's non-epistemological. I think for me that makes
Yes.
sense to call it non-epistemological.
It's like you say, I've been there, done that. It's just, yeah, I know what it was like to be there, if you want to call it learning. The problem historically, and here Heidegger strongly agrees, the problem historically is until we had written language, and the magic written language, we never learned anything indirectly. So human beings actually learn directly, and we learn directly through epistemology, and we learn directly, and that's Dasein, and that's proto-subjectivity. When you're learning, you're proto-subjective. When you reflect on what you just learned, when you learn about your learning, that's Hegel's point, that is ontology. So that's the loop between those two. And that's how most people experience their everyday experience. There's a certain ontologization, there's a certain consciousness coming and go. Most things you're doing automatically, you don't reflect on them. You basically reflect when something went wrong, or when something was a threat, or when something breaks the sort of flow that everyday life is, where I can drive a car without reflecting on anything. And reflection is beautiful, but reflection is rare. And it's costly for the brain to do. But that's what real consciousness is. There is no real full-on consciousness, no subject. Self-consciousness and Hegel is consciousness. The consciousness is there. There's none of that there. And I love ontologization. Ontologization is when you have learned that you've learned. But you're learning through epistemology. That means that even if I don't reflect on how the hammer goes, if it goes wrong, I remember what I did, so it went wrong. So I won't do that the same thing. Through pure instinct, I probably will hammer better next time. So I can learn without reflecting on it. When I reflect on my learning, then I'm ontologizing the world. And the trick is that if we understand historically that we were never like this as human beings until written language came along, where we read other people's experiences. We're not a master teaching a disciple anymore, but rather we're reading a book and then we're imitating what they tell us in the book. We read the instruction manuals. Everything. Written language has made us think that learning is about learning what's in a book. That's not learning. That has to be the learning of the learning. That has to be a later process. And we call that ontologization.
So if I can clarify that word, I think it's slightly interesting what you've done. It may also be just kind of a reiteration of kind of the architecture I already work with. So if it's ontology is coming later than epistemology, you're using ontology to describe like the science, the science of the objects. Is that right? That kind of the
Okay, so
the domain
just
of
to make
the
it
object.
clear,
You have
there is an ontic world. There's undoubtedly a world, and a world where shit happens. My philosophy starts here and now. It doesn't start in the past, doesn't start in the future. It starts here and now. Shit happens. What is shit? What does it mean that shit happens? That's my philosophy. But if you start with that, there's an ontic world, and the ontic world existed before you were born. So that world subsists in your life. There will be a world after you're dead. And you know you're going to die. And you know there's going to be a future without you. So that future subsists. But your entire life is a present to you. Your entire life is an existence where you try to hang on to certain subjectivity. And that subjectivity is your lifeline from birth till death. And that exists to you. So your life exists. So you can use the VPA framework here, and therefore your life is full of potentiality all the time. The future, which you will not be part of, can only be virtual to you. See what I mean with virtual? No idea what the future is going to be about. After dead, you're dead. So that can only be virtual to you. But what existed before you were born, which you had no effect on, which you will never be guilty of, because you were not part of it. It wasn't, not even the fact that somebody fucked somebody and you came into existence was your fault. You can't be blamed for anything prior to your birth. And that then subsists only to you, meaning it can still cause problems or possibilities in your life or whatever, because it subsists. So you can use the VPA framework that we're doing. Please remember that we never specifically said how long the present is. The present is only after the future, and it's before the past. That's all we say with VPA theory.
Well, the way I'm interpreting what you're saying is that going back to the ontology, it's the realm of beings. So you have psychology, which is a realm of beings. You have physics is a realm of beings. Sociology is a realm of beings, and that comes after this kind of epistemological phenomena. That's how I'm at least organizing it right now. I don't. You didn't really elucidate on that anymore. I don't know. But if I can help people, this is now to the audience, if you allow me to speak that way. If I can say this about your work, Alexander, for anyone who is having the kind of the not knowing where I'm sitting when I read your book, if anyone is having that kind of where do I sit when I'm doing this kind of cosmological study, thinking about this virtual, the way that I've done this before is I think about Hegel. Hegel comes back, and and I appreciate Hegel for this because I think he does something which I call an unapologetic subjectivity. He says, yeah, of course I'm Hegel. Of course I speak German. Of course I'm European. But of course I bring all of this Dasein, these limiting conditions into the moment of writing this book. But that can also just stand outside the book. Like I don't need to bring that in. Like I can kind of take some distance, and then I can be, at least as to what I'm hearing you say, I can just do the study. I can be the we. I can look at the I. I can also be the I and braid this together. I could look at the virtual, which to your credit, maybe this is a new way to framing Hegel. But I don't have to mention that I'm Hegel when I do this. And for me, being the more object-oriented of the two of us, Alexander, and I'd be curious to hear where you stand on this, Tom, because my study is very much more, I take a distance from the phenomena, I describe the object, and that object is now going to make impressions on me. And I prefer that approach because of where I want to go. And maybe that will become relevant later.
Yeah, no, but no, I totally get it. I totally get it. And most people do, and that most philosophers do too. And obviously Graham Harman does exactly that. You probably like his work. The thing though is that is just one of three categories for me. That is what ontologization is. So I create a distance, I observe an object, That's what ontologization is. That's how human beings create an ontology, and that ontology can either be compatible with the ontic or not. That depends on how much of truth I'm willing to pursue, of factual truth. So you also have the three different narratives in narratology that rhyme with this, because you're doing logos, you're doing strictly logos, you stay with the logos, you're doing ology of some kind and all that. That's perfectly fine. You're doing ontology, basically, most philosophers do. But I'm interested in time. And time is not only recycling of the past, observing things, because science does that. Science's big asset and big problem is the same. It is that science can only study the repetitions of dead objects. That's what science does. I love science, but it does nothing else. That's why science of consciousness fails, because it can only be a science of ontology, because ontology is what science is. So it becomes a science of ontology, and therefore, every time I hear somebody, it could be like even Thomas Metzinger, like his last book is 1,600 pages. He still arrives he can't arrive anywhere, because as soon as he described all the science of consciousness he's been doing, I'm just sitting there saying, yeah, that's a pretty impressive book, but it's not me. It's not my consciousness. Not at all, actually. So consciousness to me is art. Consciousness is unique every time. Every moment of consciousness is, it sounds a bit fancy, like I'm trying to flattering people here, but art can be crappy. But if anything is art and not the science, it's the prior to the science. And I believe possibly, I definitely believe the virtual belongs to art, but it's an art that has no existence yet, because it's pre-relational. Once art is created, it's definitely epistemological. I'm learning as I'm doing it. It's definitely Dasein. It's definitely proto-subjective. The artist doesn't ask himself, what am I doing? What am I doing? He's just doing things. And then he's reflecting and deciding, is this my work of art, or is it too bad and I throw it away? Or should I work on it and improve it? That's down to epistemological process again in Hegel, and artists love Hegel for the simple reason that he describes the artistic process. But I think any process of consciousness is this. This is why my term for the epistemological, for Dasein, is subconscious, so that I can save the word consciousness for when reflection has gone a full loop and a self is being created. I think for most people, consciousness, which means conscientia in Latin, that's what the word means. It's not an American English word. It's another word. If you got to take the word seriously, we should save it for the very reflective process, which goes the full loop until subject experiences subjectivity. So that's my argument. So
this is great, Alexander.
You're going to be great philosopher of science for sure. I mean, if you want to work within the ontology and do ontology, then do it. You can do science of ontology for all I care. Brilliant. But it's just that I'm interested in the other two things prior to that, where Heidegger goes with me to 1 second prior. And then I go all the way into the virtual, which Deleuze did sloppily, because virtual should be defined as pre-potential, non-potential. There's no power, nothing there. It's just infinite difference. And Badiou is the one who agrees with me on this. He's the one who does that.
So I think, if I could just make a comment, I think that it's great that we've gotten to this point in the conversation. I actually think we've made it really far. I'm surprised we've made it this far. And I think it's going to be good for our audience to kind of know where we're sitting. We've gone miles from where we were in the last conversation. So thank you, Alex. This has been great. I am curious about a few points. But I also I need to make a defense, if I frame it that way, because you're kind of saying that the investigations I'm doing in my books are only one of the three. I follow you, and I also affirm it. What I need to do, it's because where I want to go with my books. Like, I want my reader at the end of the second division of the metaphysics of the Alethian to have a tool. That means an object which they can take with them and now implement honestly, it's going to be canvases like government, community building. It's going to be practical tools that they can have. So that I set up the metaphysical structure, which backs that up and leads to this conclusion, which I still think is quite novel. I think I'm going to give that reader an object which they wouldn't have beforehand. So it's also okay if you want to give a different type of tool or object coming out of your study. Great, right?
No, I do not. I'm doing philosophy for the sake of philosophy only. It has no meaning, no point to it, nothing. It just does itself because there's a funny old guy with another funny old guy, two fucking 64-year-old Swedes who just got nothing better to do but have a glass of wine and philosophize. It has no point. We're absolutely nihilistic. We're ironic nihilists who are affirm through writing our books. So once the book's done, shit, over and done with, can't change it, been published. We never change our books in hindsight because they're also locked in with history. I do not want to change another human being ever in my work. I think firmly if human beings want to change, they can decide it for themselves. If they can use my books to anything, probably. It's somebody said about the Netocrats 25 years ago, first book. Great, now we got a handbook how I'm going to be really successful in the digital era and be fucking Netocrat and make billions of dollars. And some of those guys turned out to be startup guys in Silicon Valley, and I hate them. But they did. And how could I stop them? You know, you couldn't stop Hitler from using you as a tool. Ask Nietzsche, you know. So I am completely neutral. I do philosophy for the sake of philosophy. And I learned this from artists. Because all the best fucking artists I met that I admire, it's my choice. You can choose differently. You can write fucking instructions all the way through, and I love you for it. But you know, I'm just like, I don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just doing it for the fun of it. So I'm writing these books and I'm doing philosophy because my brain can't stop
No,
working.
you're the owl in the twilight, Alexander, because I think the feeling that Justin has, that where are you, is so imminent and so palpable in your book, because you always have these two structures. You know, you start from the twilight and you don't know where you are, and then you formulate some principles, and then you come down to the real, and then it all makes sense. And so it's like as if you were searching. And I mean, Minerva, the owl, the philosophy owl, it is something that is in between states, where it starts
Yeah.
off and tries to find something new.
The
The only
best way I've
reason
done,
the
yeah.
only reason I wouldn't buy this is because I still think your writing has been triggered by something. It's everything we deal with is some kind of frustration or something, and that trigger will be grounded in something that you're trying to overcome. So I don't know. I get it because that description you just gave, Tom, I don't want to make it seem like I didn't do that exercise. That's why I didn't just write a book of a manual of how to run a community meeting. You know, I went all the way back to just Hegel's. That's where the book kind of starts with just the plain here and now, with no distinction whatsoever. And like Hegel, I go through and make articulations and make a very complicated, potentially structure in the end. So yeah, that's my comment. I still think it
But
starts
doesn't
somewhere.
this just mean, Justin, that you are more pragmatic, or more of a
And that was
pragmatist
what I wanted to
than
say to you, Alexander. I wonder, coming from America, which has a very pragmatic kind of spirit about it, do you have a lot of American readers?
I do now, but listen. I don't care. I don't care how many readers I have. I really don't care. If
It's
nobody
just a
read the book, I
question.
wouldn't care. I didn't write the book to anybody to read. I don't need my mommy to applaud me because I've done a good thing of getting the medal. I don't. I've done my psychoanalysis. I'm through with that. I'm just basically, there's this body, and the body interacts with other bodies that stimulates it, that inspires it. Very Spinozist, I guess. But then it happens to write books. And it's likely that I'm going to write a seventh book. God knows if not. I might die, whatever. I don't care. Because I firmly believe that my type of philosopher is an ironic nihilist. And this is because ironic nihilism is the constant state. Most people can't grasp, but that's the truth. And from ironic nihilism, you can jump into the affirmative. And that's what you do when you write a book and publish the book. But once the book's out, done with, that was you who wrote that book, not who you are now. So the question is, okay, so what do I do with the rest of my life? Can't come up with anything better than maybe writing a seventh book. And then I asked John Söderqvist in his villa in Tuscany in September, would you like to write a seventh book? Man, not that fucking you doing that sort of deep male mysticism thing with Victor and the guys. Isn't that something you should do with others? And then I went through a couple of things, and he looked at a couple of my ideas on the drawing board and said, life is a work of art. Where did that come from? Is that Foucault? Everybody thinks it's Foucault because it was his philosophy. It's actually an Oscar Wilde quote. I would write a book, just judging from the title. I would love to write a book with you with that title alone, because it kicks in everything in me. I get excited about it. And I think we should write that book. I think exactly we are positioned. And if it's anything we relate to, Justin, it is the fact that if somebody's written a certain book already, I'd have to write it. I have no intention of repeating what somebody else wrote. I have no intention of writing an applause to somebody else's work. If there isn't some creativity, originality to it, it's not a work of art, then it's not a work of philosophy. And I believe Jan and I can do that. We have the capacity. But we try to find what would we be really good at doing, not in the sense that it's going to be used by, just for the sake of philosophy itself. What would we be interested in And others could possibly find it interesting that we do because we'd probably be good at it. And that's when you get enthusiasm for writing a book.
I'm very glad you said that because it feels like me and you, Alexander, are kind of going like this now. But what you just said brings us back like this. And that's because there is this kind of element of artistry behind it. And I do come from an illustrator design background, even though I've kind of evolved out of it. And I do see that being a very yeah, Hegel, Heidegger. It probably seems crazy for some people, but I see Heidegger also as this kind of artist philosopher. He's talking about how we manifest the world and the conditions for that. That's definitely an artist philosophy. I think it's inherent in Nietzsche.
This is why I love philosophy, and my tiny little contribution to the history of philosophy is what I'm working with. So for me, for example, in the 1980s, long before I started writing, but knowing I would probably end up there, I was making music at the time. I was traveling through the Middle East and India, and one of my insights that probably made me different, even from Graham Herman, to be honest about it, and I'm kind of embarrassed him with him, was that I realized, why does everybody start with the Greeks? Where did that come from? And it turns out it was just Lord Byron's idea in the 1820s. Because Lord Byron was obsessed with being a hero somewhere, pretty full of himself. And he decided to fight the Greeks versus the Ottomans. And he invented the idea the Ottomans were excluded, they were exterior, and the Greeks were somehow interior, to a sort of British imperial idea of creating a continent called Europe and Insight. Before the 1820s, nobody ever talked about Europe. There was no such concept. There was north of the Mediterranean, south Mediterranean, and there was east and west because Orthodoxy and Catholicism were different ways. There was Byzance versus Rome. They just happened to be different places on the map. But there was no concept of Europe before the British invented the 1820s. And then everybody bought into it, and we started saying, philosophy started with the Greeks. No, it started with you guys discovering that the Arabs saved a few texts from Plato on their stock that you probably would have burned, assholes, and therefore you're now constructing they're the origin of Europe when you've stolen them from the fucking Arabs and excluded them from your continent? Bad shit. Don't buy it. So I realized that to meet all these new intellectuals from Iran, India, China, new intellectuals from Peru, Nigeria today, to be in a truly global world, which I would be in my own lifetime, I had to start with the entire world history still being discovered. Göbekli Tepe came along. I went to Göbekli Tepe as soon as I found out that it existed. My point is that I think the East is older than the West, and therefore my grounding is in Buddhism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, as the philosophical schools built on what would be an Asian form of paganism. So the reformed paganism they developed is the Buddhist and Taoist and Zoroastrianism. And they're not religions in any Christian sense whatsoever. They're philosophical schools that should be read that way and philosophical practices. And I love them to bits and I learn from them. And I can spend my entire life learning from them. I still only learn that much from those schools. And I have that. And then I start looking at the West. And then I'm discovering, okay, maybe I should ask the Japanese and the Chinese and the Indians what they think of Western history. And suddenly say, yep, Spinoza, Hegel, Nietzsche. Great guys. Yeah, we could add Heidegger to that mix. The rest? Nah. Okay. And then I can reread the West as if I imagine putting on Eastern glasses and starting my philosophical history with ancient Persia, my favorite place to start, or ancient Egypt for that matter, and work from there. And then the Greeks just come into the picture. They were good at writing things down. And they were good with some of the details, and they developed certain things. Credit to them. They invented drama more than anything. But I don't start with the Greeks. Philosophy starts with Zoroaster. It starts with his invention of the concept of Masta Yasna. Masta Yasna in ancient Persian, which I speak, means the love of wisdom. Philosophia started occurring in Greece 1,200 years later, borrowed from the Persians. That's my history of philosophy, to which I add this tiny, tiny bit as a commentary in the 21st century.
Okay, yeah, and I think that was one of the first reflections I wrote to when I started processing philosophy. I was very happy that you brought in this element, and it is something that I wish I had a better understanding of. I did admit that to you right away. I think that every person will have to go through their kind of their own process of opening the world, and clearly you've had the opportunity to open that up even further. I think even for some people, going back to the Greeks will be alienating enough, kind of getting before the Latinization that kind of dominates Western discourse right now, right? And the way we make our laws and so forth, it's all Roman. Even going prior to that to the Greeks is a step, right? For my brother, for example, he's really a heavy Christian. For him, it's going back to Jesus' time, biblical stuff. People have to have their entry points, right? So eventually maybe they get to Zoroastrianism. I don't know. But it's just a comment on that. It is a good job that you've done. You've done there.
I can have these conversations with Indians, with Iranians, with Arabs and Chinese, and you can't if you start with the Greeks. They disqualify you as a post-colonial fucking racist. Leave the room, please. I mean, they do, for good reasons. So that's my point. I saw that when I was younger, and therefore I got interested in the East. And hey, I'm just dancing on the surface here, but to me, my love of philosophy is a love of philosophy for the sake of philosophy, and I write philosophy for the sake of philosophy. There's like great artists do art for the sake of art. And remember, I am an emergentist. I love difference. I love boxes. I love to separate things from one another when they have nothing to do with each other. If things go into relations, congratulations, but everything is not relational with everything else. Graham Harman agrees with me. That's his critique of Deleuze, to be honest about it. I love the boxes, and the box should be treated as such. And art can be defended for the sake of art. So why do you do art? Well, there's some guys who just want to do art. So they do art, okay? And they're lucky enough to have somebody who wants to consume or engage with that art and maybe even pay their bills or whatever, if they're lucky. Otherwise, they'll probably do art anyway, finance it through some other means than art, but they will do art because they love art. Just like religion is for the sake of religion, and philosophy is for the sake of philosophy. And philosophy must start from that ironic nihilist starting point where it says that I just happen to be a guy who admit that my psychology is that I love doing this shit, so I'm going to do it.
Well, I mean, there is the classical distinction between systematic philosophy and historical philosophy. And what you are describing is systematic philosophy that doesn't care, about framing itself and just doing the work. And then you have the university professors doing historical philosophy. What did Bard do? What did Hegel do? And so it's like you are not concerned with the latter one.
No,
Although
and
you do cite them.
seriously, that the latter one is the only one AI is going to be pretty good at, but AI is never going. The last thing AI will be able to do is to do systematic philosophy, because there will always be a lack in an AI that the AI doesn't understand is a lack, and we understand what lack is because we feel lack, we feel
Right.
void. Our own subjectivity is there because something is lacking. The only way to get over these two loops I'm talking about, when people say, where's the subject generated? What it's generated is proto-subjectivity with Dasein, with Heidegger, and then when it reflects on itself, it sees itself as subject. That's a full-on subject. The proto-subjectivity is covering up a crack, an impossible dialectical deadlock between the two loops, meaning phenomenology and ontology never meet. They never meet. What's in between them is an agent interacting with the world, which is epistemology. So there's a point to having ontologization of the phenomenological world. So there's no loop between ontology and phenomenology. I was going crazy with Hegel for years. Like, saying, why do you do a third loop? Why do you do a loop between ontology and phenomenology? And this realized he would have laughed his head off just as assumption, because it's exactly the breakdown of time in the present moment, the momentum, which makes it impossible for the phenomenology and ontology to ever meet. That means phenomenology and ontology are fundamentally different. They can never meet. We invent that meeting by putting ourselves in that position. That is what a subject is in Hegel.
I mean,
So
to aggravate you a little bit, Alexander, but it is after all the soul that our machine's missing. So.
Okay, back to Justin.
yeah, I had another maybe a bit of a trigger for you, Alexander, because Tom made this good framing of the distinction between kind of this scholarly philosophy where you do your scholarly work and this this artistry philosophy which we're talking about. And I do have to say though, your works, the one and a half that I've read, they do read more like, I mean, you do a lot of citing of external authorities, like you do cite a lot of people. So it does feel like you're doing more of this scholarly work. And in contradiction, I always felt like in kind of putting our two works together, I don't mean to drive more cleft. I enjoy our conversations. Definitely, I've enjoyed this, but I've always felt like I'm doing less of that. I do cite the guys I bring with me, but it's always, yeah, and maybe it's the same. now that I'm reflecting on it. I
But we
do so
decide,
only insofar
yeah,
as it's something that I can build upon and progress my own argument. I don't cite them as an external authority in my
no,
work.
but we don't do footnotes. So therefore the text
Yeah,
looks
that's
different.
true. Hmm.
And I didn't know this when we started. It was one of the first year Söderqvist and I started writing together. We decided to use the first year to develop a style. We have a certain style, especially the Swedish language, a very clear style. And it's fun because we have a style, we stay with the style. And the books are written in between us. It's not a Bard book, it's not a Söderqvist book, it's definitely a relational project. Something happens between us, and we write until we don't know who wrote what. And then it's a Bard Söderqvist book. So we developed the style, and going back to you said, we decided not to use footnotes because philosophy, in all its pretentiousness, and why not be pretentious? I've even done classes on why pretentiousness could be a philosophy. It's a fun game to play at Burning Man to be like, what if pretension is philosophy? What if pretentiousness is something that should be defended, metaphysically defended? Like you see how I can go queer about it, like I become like a theater faggot or whatever, but I'll talk about pretentiousness. Beautiful idea. But you could do that if you want to do it as a mind game. But here's the trick. We didn't know, but Alain Badiou and Bruno Latour, independent of us, decided the same thing. And when I started reading both Badiou and Latour, they said the same thing. Philosophy must claim, since it goes towards metaphysics, must claim to be original text. And original text doesn't have footnotes. So therefore, the quotations, and it's about crediting and not stealing as well. And the quotations are in the text, and we are building on the shoulders of giants, and why not refer to them? Because if I mention Nietzsche, I want the guys to read fucking Nietzsche. He's fantastic, right? So it's basically there's a love of philosophy that we want to pass on to people who read. Yes, love philosophy. And when they ask us, could you write something more accessible? We said, well, then we're going to compromise on the content. So we decided not to. When we wrote our second book, we had that option. We want to be best-selling coffee table books in America with the big publisher, because the Netocrats was a smash, surprisingly, or do we want to go into the world of philosophy and be uncompromising? And John and I said, no, we're going to be uncompromising. Meaning we're going to write as well as, we're going to think as well as we can. Like Heidegger says, thinking is the art in philosophy, not writing. Writing is just one of several possible expressions. No, it's the art of thinking. The art of writing, that's poetry. The art of thinking is philosophy. And we just have to nail our thinking in words for now.
I think, Justin, what you are referring to is like you have a philosophy inside academia, let's say, and then you have certain language games and certain codes that you talk to. Because you are in that academic kind of circle, you don't need to reference it that much. I mean, you can just develop thoughts because they are known, the context is known within the academic circle. But if you're like doing out philosophy outside of the academic circle, you need to rely more on references, basically.
I'm not sure. I have to think more about it. It could be like I'm not an academic philosopher. I didn't go to school for this. I read Hegel, and then there's things to say about it in my critique. Because if, as you say, Alexander, things that sat with me well, but things that didn't sit with me well. And when I sit with the object, which for me I took up in my study the object of the Silithian, when I sit with that object, Hegel didn't miss the point, or Heidegger missed the point, right? Or he wasn't clear enough. So this is, I don't know about academia, but I don't come from the discipline, but this is all it is. It's me with Hegel looking at the object, or me with Heidegger looking at the object.
I think you're fantastic, Justin. I love your book. But you might be
Thank you.
You debuted younger than I did, and maybe you're just trying to find your style, and you will over the next 3 books. You'll find a style. You discover this is so me writing. That's my subjectivity, and this is how Justin expresses his philosophy. Stay with that fucking style because you're comfortable with it. You can get better and better with the content. So. I think we're both post-academic, to be honest about it. But I wrote a book called The Netocrats, my debut, that says that politics is over, academia is over, business as we know it is over. All the entire paradigm is over in the sense that Paris 1789 is around the corner, and it's a huge revolution called digital. Now, if I wrote that, I should be aggressively anti-academic in my expression, because otherwise I'm obviously not following through with my own guidance. I mean, I want to live, if I say this is the way things are going to be, I should be part of that. So basically, then who are the netocrats? Well, they're not here yet, they're coming, meaning, oh, I write for people in the future. And there would be few people out there who might enjoy reading something like that. But when we did Synthesis, Digital Libido, and Process and Event as a trilogy from the very beginning, we decided to write about the future first, then about the current mess. Digital Libido, the dark book, is about the current mess, and it's messy, and it's going to get worse because all the old institutions are falling apart and becoming tragic before something new can appear. Then the third category was Process Event, which is rewriting all of history. And here comes the catch. Oh, that's funny. So you wrote them in the opposite order of the way things should be. You wrote the ontology last, use your own language. And we said, no, we wrote Process and Event as a book about history, as if from 100 years from now.
No, it makes sense to me. I get it. But that's also because
you get it completely.
So then, Heidegger, of course.
Yeah, and I think you're also writing for future readers in many, many ways. And what you're doing well, Justin, is the quality thing. So does Tom. You go for quality, uncompromising quality. I try to. Jan is certainly there to back me up so I don't go too wild and too psychotic. Pushing me down so we reframe it and then get quality into the whole thing. Once you write with that quality, you know that, oh my God, this book is going to be around for quite some time. It might not even have its audience yet. I don't need to worry about the sales figures, and nobody does who works for me because they're interested in the quality of the work. So if I can just have people around me interested in the quality of the work, uncompromising about it, not worry about the quantity, because I'm not going to make any money from book sales. I make the money from publishing these books. The books are challenging. People realize I'm smart, and they hire me for different kinds of projects that I say yes or no to. And that pays off 1,000 times better than book sales ever would. Then I'm happy to do it. It works.
So how much time do we have? I see we've talked for an hour. Because where I want to go here next is maybe your next book, but maybe that's for another conversation. Because you said now, in the previous conversation, anyway, you had said that Heidegger offered something a bit novel for you. It opened a space, and it is true he's interested in the moment of vision where the past and the potential of the future draws from the past and the present moment. This is where the here and the now unfolds, so forth. This is where I'd be curious to take a conversation like this next, but I don't know, it seems like also a natural break for another conversation.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can have like 30 more minutes, but my feeling was that you had more questions to begin with. You started.
Yeah, I think you both. I think Justin, that is the next third episode, maybe in the early spring or something. But
honestly, all my questions that I came in with were answered in a roundabout way without me asking them. It was this cosmological positioning that I brought up, this kind of dissonance I had while writing the books. I wanted to go there. I wanted to talk about what the definition of a science is. I think we've clarified that. This difference between possibility and potential, I think we now, and our audience probably has a better picture of that. So yeah, these were complex questions.
But why don't we go back to your work, Justin, because you are much further ahead with the next book. I'm still studying and putting things together for possibly a 7th and even 8th book. But I'm in that mode. That's why I canceled my course at Parallax this fall, because I don't think people even got where I was doing lectures at the moment. It was very, very unclear. And then Tom reminded me of that and said, yeah, let's have more conversations with Justin. Let's do more Bard versus Amarque featuring guests, which we're doing, which I love. And to be honest about it, you probably got more out of me today, Justin, than anybody would have got of me doing those 3 lectures with Tom, to be honest about it. Because you're pretty much where I'm at the moment.
It then, right?
Yeah, but where are you at with the second part of your metaphysics?
Well, that's very nice that you asked that.
I am certainly very interested. So why don't we round that off at the end of the second episode?
Yeah. And since you bring this up, I've actually delivered my 3rd book, which is the second through Parallax.
We should point out, though, that Tom has been unfaithful. He's written a fucking novel called The Infinite Now in Between. You see, he sort of left the field of philosophy, going off and become a novelist all of a sudden.
Well, to be honest,
no, that's an old thing, but
a perfect topic for this. I mean, that's also Heidegger, right?
True. But I'm not an expert on novels at all. No, stay with you, Justin. So where are you at with your second episode of your metaphysics?
Yeah, well, I'm very happy where I landed, and of course, when you do this, you like an artist, you work with the material, like working with the clay, it makes the impact back on you, and you have these great feedback loops. It's a great process, right? I've always lived this process my whole life, working with my material. So this book had the same type of effect, surprises. I didn't know I would land there. Then in conclusion, it looks like it could have gone no other way, right? Because in the first book, I set up this framework, the proiactum and the subiactum, which I call the Alethian. And in the second half, it just crystallizes why that needed to be made. I mean, it seems stupid that I would have gone into a two-part project without understanding the relevancy of that. But then this proactum
We
becomes
define them here. Define them for those who are listening here
yeah,
and getting engaged and not having read your book yet, which I highly
sure.
recommend. Define those
Uh,
terms so we nail
well,
them.
when
Yeah.
when I read Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, and I even throw in Marx in this bunch because of where I want to go with it. I want to get a tool. Um, I read them as laying out a framework through which possibilities manifest. They manifest as the self. They manifest as the Heideggerian example, the hammer banging, all this pre-ontological stuff. You know, it manifests as actual, right? So I needed to extract that frame from those thinkers. So I needed to just to crystallize it as something independent, and it's the proreactum. It's obviously Latin, projection before the act. I actually like the definition of before, the translation of before the act, that hints to this kind of pre-ontological notion. So I lay all that out in the first book, right? And I do that through a study of the Alethian, which I call my subiactum, which is my subject matter of study, which allows for a description of the proreactum by observing it, by watching it as it manifests as the actual, right? And I do this very phenomenological, not in a Husserl Heideggerian way, but honestly more in the Hegelian way. I do that type of phenomenological investigation. I start with the here and now, and I look at how it manifests, right? So in the end, I come up to a complete description of the, and because I like the Greek, I try to pull on this. We touched on this last time to kind of alienate, and we talked about it this time too, and alienate us from our kind of Roman heritage. Let's get back behind our heritage, but before Rome, right? Before we start thinking of government as laws only and so forth, let's go back to the Greeks. So I call all this the catachythonius, right? This is the subterranean before it arises, and we have our flourishing fruits and vegetables, right? We're Demeter here, right? We're in the realm of the subterranean. So I describe all of that, right? So then the second part of this study is I've got these objects, as I've referenced them, I've got these tools. How can we apply this to ethics and morality? How can we apply this idea of this proiactum in a fruitful fashion for ultimately one of the big struggles that I've had in my life is both personal and I see in others, is simply just what Heidegger would call like the disclosure of truth, right? Just talking about how we actually feel about things. There's so many layers of crap that we have to work through. And I think if you have that proiactum structure, you at least now know how truth, the Alethian, manifests. So now we can apply that in practical cases and hopefully nurture the disclosure of truth, nurture more authenticity, right? And these words are very
So what I'm asking you when Roberto Sedicus comes into the picture, and probably Tom too, is that I define truth as three different truths for human beings, and they're irreducible to one another, and that's why they're being confused. And I'm a Zoroastrian. For me, truth is everything. It's all there is. There are no Zoroastrians don't have any 10 commandments or anything because it's only one thing: truth, Asha. And druj is the lack of truth, the void where truth does not exist. That's the opposite of Asha. Asha, druj, and those are the only two principles I work with. And I want to be personified. I want to be Nashavan myself in my work. What I then do is that I discover that because we can never make our thoughts and our feelings combine, and the better understood separately. What turns out is that if you allow feelings and facts to be, feelings and thoughts are concerned with facts, closer to facts than feelings are, then they must describe it differently. So I call pathical truth is my emotional truth. When I say that this is what I feel, this is undeniably true to me. I am true to myself is a perfect expression in the English language, but describes pathical truth. I feel that I am now myself, the one I should be, whatever I decided to be, this is what I am myself in this experience. And that's pathical truth. And obviously the other one is logical truth, which we call factuality or actuality. So actuality becomes factuality. It's just like the facts. What happened? What was really there? Science is concerned with factual truth all the time. Now, because these are irreducible to each other, don't meet, they happen to be like phenomenology and ontology, they don't meet. Therefore, we invent a category in between, which is epistemology, where there's a possibility of appropriate subjectivity to occur in the action between an agent and the world. Great. Okay. Could we do the same thing here? And it turns out we do. Human beings do. We invent myths. And a myth is a temporary truth that temporarily seems to be able to unite pathos and logos into one. This rhymes with Deleuze, Foucault, the best of the postmodernists, wherever they arrived. It's basically that storytelling is how human beings basically construct truth. And the perfect example of that is to say that, well, at the end of the day, you're going to be much more truthful to who you are and what it means to be human by watching a Shakespeare play than you'll ever be by reading a Richard Dawkins book. Right? So mythos is superior to logos in understanding the human condition. That is evidence that mythos is the only unification. But the curse of mythos is that it's only temporary. And that means I've got three truths, irreducible to one another. Hegel would probably agree. And it's better for people to teach them, why don't we have three different truths? Don't mistake one for the other. You're allowed to have all three. Actually, we need all three. We base society on these three different types of truth, and we should not allow anybody to try to reduce anyone on the other or say one is superior to the other. This is what we call narratology, and that's basically how we feel we completed Hegelian metaphysics by giving it a sort of a term from a narrative perspective, which Hegel never did. And therefore, there's a certain amount of Nietzsche to it. But I think that rhymes in with your philosophy too. You could play with it as you like if you want to use the categories, but the irreducibility is what's interesting. And as always, irreducibility, dialectical deadlocks, is the possibility for subjectivity.
Yeah, I follow. Yeah, about using it, I don't know. I'll have to. My first book was called How to Nurture Truth and Authenticity, which was the practical application without any metaphysics. It was written more for a general audience. Maybe it would have a place in there. I've already delivered this second book, and I'm very happy with my application of this proiactum in very practical applications, management, policy. It gets a bit rigid. Maybe you're not there, Tom, yet, but it gets a bit rigid near the end, and I'm very satisfied where that goes. But there could be a place for it. Yeah, I'm not denying that. I'll have to think more about that. But I follow what you said. It makes sense.
I wonder. I mean, I think it was Popper who wondered and asked himself, how do you justify your first principles and to coming to truth? And he talked about the dogma, the tautology, and the infinite regress. And he basically said there is no other way around it. And so I was wondering, like, how do you guys approach your own philosophies in terms of how do you justify your ultimate or your first claims in terms of your metaphysics, your philosophical ideas? Is it more like a dogma, this is true, or is it like an implicit tautology, or is it like it's because of this and it's because of this, it's an infinite regress? Like, what avenue did you choose?
Graham Harman says the world consists of waves and stones long before we're born. The square.
So that's a dogma then.
No,
that would be a dogma.
No, wait. It's not. Wait a second. Wait a second. That's not the dogma. It's saying the waves and stones are incompatible with one another, irreducible to one another. The world consists of both. Because the world consists of discretions and continuities in physics, in sub-physics even, in physics, biology, and everything. So I was born into a world where there are incompatible things and irreducibilities. Graham Priest agrees. He says the one is actually the one of the many. So our book was called Process and Event, and we're basically laying it out, saying that we discovered it already during the Bronze Age. There was process, there was capacity for event, and whenever we went wrong and became dogmatic, it was because we either thought the world was only process and triad, but it's nothing but process, or we went for the event, like Islam and Christianity did. There is only the event, there's only linear history, nothing else, meaning they end up repeating the same fucking Christ on a cross every fucking time. So, There are two things going on here, process and event. They're irreducible to one another. What if my own sense of a self is exactly what I put on top of that irreducibility and that subjectivity? Even kids can get that. So I start my philosophy there. I started with dialectics first. I'm a pan-dialecticist. I even believe the ontic world is fundamentally dialectical. And it seems like mathematics is that as well. So whenever we go towards anything, we discover we have reducibilities and we have these things that are just differences. And at least we know one thing. If there wasn't a fundamental difference, there'd be no world. So for me, difference is first category.
How's it about you, Justin? How would you approach that?
I may have to go soon. I see that there may be some activity forming around me, but I can answer the question and then maybe wrap it up. I think for me it's much more. It's gonna be very resonant, basically to the words we've said so far. But it's very phenomenological. I start with just how does the world hit me, and then how do I describe that? That's the immediacy of the truth and the starting point. But then, of course, these words that we've inherited need to be challenged. The words, and I think your book, Phenomenology of Spirit, or Phenomenology of Will, has also done this, Tom. We take an object, we realize it partially describes something, but it needs to be reinterpreted. So maybe this is the dialectical loop that you're talking about, Alex.
No, so you're what you're describing is a tautology, basically.
Yeah,
which is not bad. Which is not bad.
I understand. I would be fine with that description for now. Yeah, maybe it needs revised
Because I do it dogmatically. Just as a reference. I'm not. It's like you have to start somewhere, right? And in the phenomenology of will, I start with the dogma, and the dogma is you have to observe for everything to come to any statement of truth. That's a dogma. We're not hearing you, Alexander.
To say that there's no dogma is in itself dogmatic. So
yes.
In tautology, yeah, I'm working on a concept we could develop next episode, which I love, which has not been written about yet. I call it symmetricism. And it's an idea borrowed from physics. And I take it very, 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 very seriously because we only have one massive asymmetry, and that is time. And to deal with the philosophy of time properly, we have to ask, is it possible, for example, to think that there is a symmetry of time? Yes, but we need at least one more universe to do that. I find that idea incredibly interesting. Physicists like need to work onto it. And I want to go into dialogue with those physicists to see if we could do the philosophical proper work on it, because it could turn out that nothing can exist if it doesn't borrow from something else, which is its own opposite. You have lots of questions like this in physics. Why is this more matter than antimatter? Because otherwise there wouldn't be a universe to begin with. Well, maybe there's another universe which is more antimatter than matter, and therefore that universe can exist. I call it symmetricism. It's an interesting idea because fundamentally certain things like mathematics is definitely nothing but tautology. It's just tautology based on symmetries. That's what mathematics is. There's nothing there. That's why mathematics isn't invented. It's discovered. It's just unfolding on more and more tautology. That's what it is. So a lot of what human beings do are that without thinking about it. So I think Popper was probably onto something there. Maybe he's even talking about one of the same thing when he said three different categories. Maybe it is that the world is symmetricist and we're symmetricist beings that are being asymmetric temporarily. That's what we exist. It's an amazing
Let's do
idea.
Let's do that for the next talk. That sounds super, super intriguing.
Yep.
Alexander, Justin, thank you so much for taking the time again.
Big love to you both. Wonderful conversation. Wonderful conversation. Forward to more of it.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Big love.